Hello everyone, I hope you're doing good and staying safe. Welcome to SimpliCode's YouTube channel. In today's session, we'll be going through some most asked SQL interview questions by various companies such as Cognizant, Accenture, Deloitte and other top recruiting MNC companies. As you all know, SQL, which is a language of databases, is considered as one of the most oldest languages in the technology domain and is highly significant today as companies across the world are gathering massive amounts of data for their growth. SQL consistently ranks high in the most requested tech skills and learning. It will add a great value to your array of skills. SQL is a powerful and dependable tool for extracting relevant and useful data from large data sets. While SQL has traditionally been the domain of highly trained data analysts and programmers, it is gaining a lot of popularity nowadays among non-technical professionals as well. Also, looking at the job opportunities, we can see an enormous demand for SQL developers across the globe. From finance to tech companies, consulting to e-commerce companies, it is quite evident that SQL is the most in-demand skill right now. So in today's tutorial, we will be discussing some basic interview questions on SQL that may strike in your next interview during your campus placements or even off campus as well. But before we begin, if you're new to the channel and a tech geek and love watching tech videos, consider getting subscribed to our channel SimpliCode to stay updated with all the latest technologies. So without any further ado, let's get started. The first question is, what is SQL and how does it work? Structured Query Language or SQL is a language to operate databases which helps in database creation, deletion, fetching rows, modifying rows, and so much more. SQL is a standard language for relational database systems. All the relational database systems like MySQL, MS Access, Oracle, Sybase, Informix and other NoSQL PSQL languages use SQL as their standard database languages. SQL comes with a dozen of advantages like it allows you to create and drop databases and tables, set permissions on tables, procedures and views and so much more. SQL is easy to learn as the statements comprise of descriptive English words and sentences and are not case sensitive. We can create and interact with database using SQL in an efficient and an easy way. The benefit with SQL is that we don't have to specify how to get the data from the database. Rather, we simply specify what is to be retrieved and SQL does the rest. Also called a query language, SQL can do much more besides querying. As we discussed earlier, it provides statements for defining the structure of the data, manipulating data, declaring constraints, and retrieving data from the database, depending on various conditions and our requirements. Now, the working of SQL is also very simple. A typical SQL process takes place with the help of a database server and a SQL engine. Now, if you look at the diagram, we have an end user, we have a database server, SQL engine database, and a record. Now, to understand how SQL works, let us take an example. Suppose John is an HR manager working in an organization. He wants information of all the employees who have joined last year. For that, John writes an SQL query in his laptop to retrieve the data. Now, in order to execute the query, it must interact with relational DBMS, and the request should be a valid query before the SQL engine can process it. The SQL engine then writes to and retrieves data from a database server. Now, to retrieve the data, the query processor is the SQL engine accepts and executes SQL commands from the database server to forward it to an application server. Now, this application server processes the SQL request and sends it to a web server where the user can access the information via SQL database table. Now, if the required data is found in the tables, the database server sends the information back to the user. In this way, John can retrieve the information from the database using SQL. So that was all about SQL and how does it work. Let us now move to the next question. What are the usages of SQL? Or you might be asked in another way, like why we use SQL. SQL is responsible for maintaining the relational data and data stores present in the database. It is used to query and manipulate data stored in the relational databases. Some of the features of SQL are, it is used to execute queries against a database. It retrieves the data from the database. We can perform various operations like insert, update, and delete, and many other operations on SQL database tables as well. And it can also perform complex operations on the database using various clauses, operators, and functions in the SQL. A database is an organized collection of structured information or data typically stored electronically in a computer system. A database is usually controlled by database management system DBMS. Together, the data and the DBMS along with the applications that are associated with them are referred to as a database system, often shortened to just database. Now, data with the most common types of database in operation today is typically modeled in rows and columns in a series of tables to make processing and data querying efficient. The data can then be easily accessed, managed, modified, updated, and organized in these databases. Now, most databases use SQL for writing queries and to retrieve that information from the databases. Now, some popular SQL databases are PostgreSQL, MySQL, Oracle, Microsoft SQL Server, MongoDB, and others. Well, moving ahead, the next question is, what do you understand by tables and fields in a database? A table is a set of data that are organized in a model with columns and rows. Columns can be categorized as vertical and rows are horizontal fields. A table has a specified number of columns called fields but can have any number of rows which is called a record. Now, if you take an example of a table that is given here, the salary is a field. In the similar way, employee ID, employee name, job, and department also come under the field. Now, the vertical rows are categorized as columns, and we have 5 different columns which are employee ID, employee name, job, department, and salary. And the horizontal rows are categorized as rows or tuple, which is basically the information that we put into our database tables. Right. The next question is, mention different types of commands used in SQL. SQL commands are instructions for communicating with the database and are used to carry out specific tasks, work, and functions on database data. Now, SQL commands are further categorized into 4 different types. The first one is Data Definition Language or DDL. DDL helps the user to define the database structure or schemas that are capable of creating, deleting, and modifying data. Create, drop, alter, truncate are some examples of DDL commands or statements. We have Data Manipulation Language or DML. DML is used to modify or manipulate data present in the database tables. Insert, update, select, and delete are some SQL commands that come under DML. Next, we have Data Control Language or DCL. DCL is used to control access to the data stored in the database by granting and revoking permission to the user. And finally, we have Transaction Control Language, TCL. It is used for managing and controlling the transactions in a database to maintain consistency. Commit and rollback commands come under TCL. We also have Data Query Language additionally, which is used to retrieve the data from the database. Select commands lets the user query the database to fetch data from the tables. The next question is, what are the statements used under DML commands? Now, this might be a follow-up question for the previous question that we have discussed, which is types of SQL commands. Interviewer wants to know whether really understood the statements that you have covered under the DML commands and understood them in a very good way. Now, for that, you have to be familiar with all the DML commands. So you might be asked any one of these commands in your interview as well. So there are 4 different types of statements used under DML commands. The first one is select. This command is used to fetch data from a database table. Next, we have insert. This command allows inserting data into the table or database. That is, if you want to enter a new record into our already existing table, you can use the insert command. Next, we have the update. This command allows modifying a data in the table. Now, for some reasons, if you want to change the data that is present in your table, you can use the update command. And finally, we have the delete. This command allows deleting specific rows or all the rows from a table. Moving ahead, the next question is, what is the difference between delete and truncate? Difference between delete and truncate command is the most common part of an interview question and is asked in various interviews by the recruiters. They are mainly used to delete the data from the database, but eventually they have some differences between them as well. Now, the first difference is the delete command is used to delete a specified amount of rows. That is, you can delete either a single row or more than one row. Whereas the truncate command is used to delete all the rows at a time from a table. Delete is a DML command, which is a data manipulation language, whereas the truncate comes under the DDL, which is the data definition language. Now, using delete, there may be a where clause in the delete command in order to further the records, whereas in truncate, there is no where clause in the truncate command. Now, in delete command, the changes can be rolled back. That is, if you have deleted a particular set of rows, you can use the rollback statement to bring back those records that you have deleted. Where in case of truncate, once the changes are made, they cannot be rolled back. Now, delete is slower than truncate, whereas the truncate is faster than delete. Now, that's because this delete command is very slow because it maintains the transaction loss, whereas the truncate command is fast because it deletes entire data at a time without maintaining any transaction loss. As in the same way, the delete statement occupies more transaction space than the truncate because it maintains a log for each deleted row, whereas the truncate statement occupies less transaction space because it maintains a transaction log for the entire data page instead of each row. So those are the main differences between delete and truncate. Right, moving ahead, the next question is, what are the constraints in SQL? Constraints are a set of rules imposed on the tables of relational databases. Constraints help in maintaining the data accuracy, integrity, and reliability of a database. Constraints can be imposed at the time of creation of the table or after its creation as well. Now, constraints can be a column level or table level. Column level constraints apply to a column and the table level constraints apply to the whole table. Now, the following constraints are which are commonly used in SQL are: the first one is unique constraint is specified with a column, tells that the all values in a column must be unique. That is, the values in any row of a column must not be repeated. Next, we have primary key. A primary key is a field which can uniquely identify each row in a table, and this constraint is used to specify a field in a table as a primary key. Next, we have foreign key. A foreign key is a field which can be uniquely identified each row in other table, and this constraint is used to specify a field as a foreign key. Next, we have the default constraint. This constraint specifies a default value for the column when no value is specified by the user. Next, we have the check constraint. The check constraint helps to validate the values of a column to meet a particular condition. That is, it helps to ensure that the value stored in a column meets a specified condition. And finally, we have the not null constraint. This constraint basically tells that we cannot store a null value in a column. That is, if a column is specified as not null, then we'll not be able to store null value in this particular column anymore. And you have to give a value to it. So that was all about constraints in SQL. Right. The next question is, what do you understand by the term clause, and explain various clauses in SQL? Now, clauses are built-in functions available to the user in SQL. With the help of clauses, we can deal with data easily stored in the table. SQL clause helps to limit the result set by providing a condition to the query and helps to filter records from the entire set of records. Now, we have various clauses in SQL. Some of them are, the first one is where clause. Where clause is used to filter the records in the database. Order by clause. Order by clause is used to sort the data either in ascending or descending order using the ASC and the DESC keywords in the SQL queries. And next, we have the group by clause. Group by clause is used to group entries with identical data and may be used with aggregation methods to obtain summarized database result. This can be used when you are performing aggregate operations for the database tables. Next, we have having. Having is similar to that of where clause, but it filters the records or the rows where aggregate values meet the specified conditions only. Next, we have the limit clause. Limit clause is used to specify only a certain number of results in the query of a resultant set table. That is, if you want to specify or retrieve only a particular number of records, let's say the top 50 or the first 50 records in the table, in that case you can use the limit, which will specify only a limited number of records. And finally, we have the distinct clause, which will basically delete all the rows having duplicate values. That means if in your database table, if any record has been repeated multiple times, then the distinct clause is used to discard all those rows. Moving ahead, the next question is, what are different types of operators used in SQL? Operators are the foundation of any programming language, be it SQL or any other programming language like C, C++, Java and other programming languages. Now we can define operators as the symbols that help us to perform specific mathematical and logical computations on our SQL databases tables. Now in SQL we have multiple types of operators available, which we'll be discussing shortly. Now we use SQL operators to specify conditions and statements satisfying a query of a desired data input. Now the first type of operator is basically the arithmetic operators, which are used to perform day-to-day operations like addition, subtraction, multiplication, division and remainder and modulus operations. Next we have the bitwise operators, and in bitwise operators we have bitwise AND, bitwise OR, bitwise XOR, etc. Next we have comparison operators. As the word suggests, we use this operator to compare the values in our SQL database table. Equal to, not equal to, greater than, not greater than, less than, not less than, not equal to, etc. are some examples of comparison operators. Next we have compound operators, which are similar to that of arithmetic operators, but be examples such as add equals, multiply equals, subtract equals, divide equals and modulo equals. Next we have the logical operators. In SQL, the logical operators are used for filtering the data and getting precise results based on a given condition. The SQL logical operators are also used to combine multiple conditions. These operators can be combined to test for multiple conditions in a select, insert, update or delete statements. Examples of logical operators are all, and, between, not, exist, or, in, like and is null. And finally we have string operators, and some examples of string operators are string concatenations, wildcard, character matches and etc. The next question is, name the operator which is used for pattern matching in SQL. The SQL like operator is a command that is used for pattern matching that determines whether a specific character string matches a pattern. Like operator is frequently used in a where clause to look for a specific pattern in a column. Now the SQL pattern matching provides for pattern search in data if you have no clue as to what the word should be that is present in your database table. Now this kind of SQL query uses wildcards to match a string pattern rather than writing the exact word. The like operator is used in conjunction with SQL wildcards to fetch the required information. Using the percentage wildcard symbol to perform a simple search, which basically matches 0 or more one character of any type and can be used to define wildcards both before and after the pattern search in our database table. And similarly, we have the underscore wildcard, which matches exactly one character rather than multiple characters of any type. It can be used in conjunction with the underscore as well as the percentage wildcard as well. So in this way, the SQL like operator is the one which is used for pattern matching in SQL. Moving ahead, the next question is, what is the difference between SQL and MySQL? This is one of the most frequently asked questions in your interviews, and the interviewer expects whether you're familiar on the differences between the SQL and MySQL. So SQL is basically a programming language which has a particular syntax in English words and etc. Whereas MySQL, it is an RDBMS, which is a relational database management system. SQL is used for querying relational database system, whereas MySQL is used to modify and delete data in the database in an organized way. SQL, though considered as a language, we have SQL Server, which is a licensed product of Microsoft. MySQL is an open source platform managed by Oracle Corporation. SQL provides adequate protection to SQL servers against intruders. Whereas MySQL, being an open source platform, security cannot be reliable and can be at risk sometimes. And finally, SQL doesn't support any connectors, whereas MySQL support connectors such as Workbench tools and many other such tools to build database, etc. Next, what is the difference? What is the main difference between where and having clause? Now, where clause is used to filter the records from the table based on the specified condition, whereas having clause is used to filter records from the group based on the specified condition. Where clause can be used without the group by clause, whereas the having clause cannot be used without using the group by clause. Where clause implements in a row operation, whereas the having clause implements in column operations. Where clause cannot contain aggregate functions, whereas having clause can contain aggregate functions. And finally, where clause can be used with select, update, delete statements, and on the other hand, having clause can only be used with the select statement. So these were the some main differences between where and having clause in SQL. Now the next question is, what are keys in SQL and why do we use them? The SQL keys is an attribute or set of attributes which helps you to identify a row in a table. They also help in establishing a relation between multiple tables in the databases as well. Now the reason why we use SQL keys are, keys identify each record separately and uniquely. Now if you're working on a large data sets, you might want to specify a different key to each column because you want to uniquely identify each and every record using certain columns, right? So in that case, you have to use keys. Now, keys also allows the user to establish and identify a relationship between tables. And finally, it accesses or manages the stored data quickly and right. Moving ahead, the next question is, mention different types of keys used in SQL. Now, this is again another follow-up question to the SQL keys which we have discussed earlier, and the interviewer or the recruiter might want to know whether you have the knowledge of various different types of keys that are used in SQL. Now, there are primarily 4 different types of keys used in SQL. The first one is basically the primary key. The primary key in SQL is a single or group of fields or columns that can uniquely identify a row in a table. Now, let's say if you're working on an employee table, so in that case, you can see employee ID as a primary key because it uniquely identifies each and every record or the details of an employee in that table. Next, we have the super key. A super key is basically a combination of all possible attributes which can uniquely identify the rows in a table. Next, we have the candidate key. Candidate key can be identified or defined as a set of one or more columns that can identify a record, a tuple uniquely in a table. So along with the primary key, there may be some other columns of fields where you can easily identify a unique manner. So in that case, you'll use the candidate key. Now, for example, let's say Aadhaar card, PAN card are some examples of candidate key, as they also work in a similar fashion to that of primary key, which uniquely identifies the records of those employees in the table. And finally, we have foreign key. A foreign key is a set of attributes in a table that refers to the primary key of another table. So these were the different types of keys that are used in SQL. Right. The next question is, what's the difference between char and varchar data type? Now, speaking of char, it is a fixed length character string data type, whereas varchar or variable character is a variable length character string data type. Char data type can be a set of multiple bytes, whereas the varchar can accept character strings up to 255 bytes. Char data type can be used when the character length is known, whereas varchar data type is used when the character length is not known. Next, the char is used when the character length of the data is same, whereas the varchar is used when the character length of the data is variable. Now, char is considered as a static data type and is given static memory allocation because it only stores the character values, whereas the varchar is considered as a dynamic data type and is given dynamic memory allocation because it has various string like characters and variables to be stored in the tables. So that were the main differences between the char and varchar data types. Moving ahead, the next question is, what are aggregate functions in SQL? An aggregate function in SQL performs calculation on multiple values and returns a single value. It allows the user to perform complex calculation on a set of values to return a single scalar value. We often use these aggregate functions with the group by and having clauses of the select statement. Now, SQL aggregate functions are further classified into 5 types. The first one is count. Next one is sum. Next we have average, and then we have minimum, and finally we have maximum. Right. Next question is write an SQL query to find second highest salary from employee table. Now, other than some definitions and other theoretical questions, you might be asked to write some basic SQL queries during your interviews. Now, we all know to find the highest salary in employee, the following query is select ID employee name max salary from employee. Basically, we are selecting ID employee name as the columns in our resultant set, and we are using the aggregate function max to the salary field, which will basically retrieve the maximum salary of that employee present in that employee table. Right, now this is clear and it's a piece of cake to do, right? Now to find the second highest salary in employee, the following query would be select ID employee name maximum salary from employee where salary is less than. Now we have to use a subquery here, which is select maximum salary from employee. Now what this query basically does is it basically processes the inner query, which is select max salary from employee. Now once it executes this, now the outer query gets executed, which is it will display the ID employee name maximum salary of the employee whose salary is less than the maximum salary which you have calculated earlier. So in this way you can find the second highest salary in employee using a subquery. Now the next question is what are subqueries in SQL and why we use them, which is obviously a follow-up query that we have discussed earlier. A subquery is basically a type of query which is written inside another query. A subquery becomes a part of a larger query, and a subquery is also called as inner query or a nested query. A subquery provides data to the main query, also called parent query or the outer query. A subquery is basically a select statement that is embedded in a clause of another SQL statement, and the inner query is executed once before its parent or outer query so that the results of an inner query can be passed to the outer query. Now what I mean is, like, let's take an example here which we have is select name listed price from orders where listed price is greater than select average listed price from orders. Now we have a subquery which is select average listed price from orders, which is basically an inner query or the nested query. Now first this part of the query gets executed where it will select the average price of the listed prices in the orders table, and finally it will display the records of all those items and its listed price on the orders which is greater than the average of the listed prices, which is basically the inner query. So in this way we can use these subqueries to perform complex operations on our table databases. Right, moving ahead, what are joins in SQL and mention it types? The SQL join clause is used to combine records or rows from two or more tables in a SQL database based on a related column between one or two tables. SQL joins are mostly used when a user is trying to fetch data from multiple tables. Join keyword merges two or more tables and creates a temporary resultant set of the merged tables. We can join the table using a select statement and a join condition, and the query is followed as select table1 dot column 1 comma table1 dot column 2 comma table2 dot column 1 comma table2 dot column 2 and so on from table 1 join condition, which is basically the type of join you want to apply to your SQL query. It may be inner join, outer join, left join or outer join. On table 2 on provide the condition on which you want to join the tables, that is table1 dot column is equals to table2 dot column. So in this way you can use the joins in SQL as well. Now moving ahead, the next question is what are joins in SQL and mention its types. Now we have basically four different types of joins in SQL, which is the first one is inner join. The inner join basically returns records that have matching values in both the tables. That is, if you consider tables and if you want to get the common values that are present in both the tables, in that case you will use the inner join. Next we have the outer join or full outer join, which basically returns all the records when there is a match in either left or right table. Now outer join basically what it does is no matter if it has any matching values or not, it will display all the records from both the tables, that is table 1 and table 2. Next we have the left join. Left outer join returns all the records from the left table and only the matching records from the right table. Now left join is used only when if you want to display the records from the first table and only the matching values that are present in the second table. So in that case you can use the left outer join. And finally we have the right outer join or right outer join, which basically returns all the records from right table and only the matching records from the left table. So in this way you can use different types of joins in your SQL queries as well. Right, the next question is, write an SQL query to find names of all the employees that begins with A. I think this is a simple query, and to display the details of all the employees whose name begins with A, we need to type this following query, which is used with the like operator, and the query is followed as select star from employee where E name, which is basically I'm taking as the column name, like a percentage. So this will basically display records of all those employees whose name starts with A. And similarly, you might be asked to display the names of all the employees that ends with A, and the following queries are similar to that of the first one we have discussed, and the only difference is you have to change the percentage sign, and the query is followed as select star from employee where E name like. Now instead of putting the character A in the first, we have to place the percentage wildcard first and then the A character, which basically display all the records of employees whose name might be starting with any character, but it should end with A. Moving ahead, the next question is, write an SQL query to return even and odd number records from a table. Now to find and return the records with the odd or even values, we need to check the remainder when we divide the column value by 2. Now when the remainder is 0, that's an even number, otherwise that's an odd number. Now if you take an example here, in order to display even number of records, we are using the modulus operator here. And the query is followed as select star from table where ID modulus 2 is equals to 0. Now if you take an employee table, let's say they're having employee ID starting from 100. Now 100 modulus 2 is basically equals to 0. So it basically returns the even number records there. And similarly, all the employees having their ID even numbers, that is 100, 102, 104, 106 and so on, and all those records will be displayed in a resultant set. And similarly, in order to display odd number records, we use the following query: select star from table where ID modulus 2 not equals to 0. Now if you take the employee ID as 101, when you perform the operation 101 modulus 2, you have the remainder as 1, which is basically not equals 0, and it is a odd number record. So employee is having employee IDs like 101, 103, 105 and so on in odd numbered places will basically return the records. So in this way you can return even and odd number records from the table using the modulus operator. Moving ahead, the next question is, explain what is an alias in SQL and why we use it. Alias in SQL is basically a temporary name that is given to a table or column while writing a query. This is usually done when the column or table names are long. Giving aliases makes the table or column name more readable and is also preferred when there are a lot of queries written for a table. The alias is based in SQL is a temporary change and only exists till the duration of that. Now to give an alias name for a column, the query is followed as select column name as alias name from table name. For example, I have the column name as employee name and I just want to give the alias as EN. So in this way, I'm using the alias name for the column name as well. And similarly, if I want to give alias name for table, the following select column 1, column 2 from table name as alias name. So just like in a way you've given the alias name for your columns, you can similarly the alias name for your table as well. Moving ahead, how to create a new table from an existing table. Now a copy of table can be created from an existing table using the combination of create and select statements. Using these two statements, we can either select all the columns or only a specific columns from an existing table. As a result, the new table will be replaced with all the values of the existing table, and the where clause can also be used as an optional statement to select the specific columns from the table. And the syntax is followed as create table, new table name 1, as select, mention all the columns that you want to retrieve from the existing table, which is from existing table 1, and you can also specify the condition using the where clause as well. And finally, the question is, what are the applications of SQL in real life? Now, SQL is used in various fields in nowadays. For example, SQL is used in banking, it is used in education, it is used in finance sector, it is used in healthcare, it is used in e-commerce sector, it is used in traveling sector, it is used in manufacturing sector as well. Now, talking about banking, SQL is one of the major components of the banking sectors. Like banks store the account details of customers and the transactions that are done on a daily basis in databases. Now in education, schools and universities use SQL and databases to store and retrieve information about their students, faculty and staff. SQL is also used in finance sector, where it's another massive area where SQL queries are used regularly in managing the assets, revenue details, shares of the companies as well. Execution and retrieval of data plays an important role for all the businesses and finance segments to make strategies and derive insights from it. SQL is also used rapidly and extensively in healthcare sector as well, where hospitals and other medical centers use SQL to store the details of their patients without any hassle. It also helps in maintaining all the documents and the bills of the patients. And similarly, in manufacturing sector also, we have a lot of applications of SQL as well to track the shipments, etc. Now in travel aspects of also we use the SQL, wherein the details of the customers who are traveling can also be used with the help of SQL. And finally, SQL is also used in e-commerce. Like we have Amazon, which is probably one of the biggest e-commerce companies in the world, which is used to locate or heavily rely on SQL to make better decisions and provide solutions and service to its customers. So these were some of the applications of SQL in real life. And with that, we have come to the end of today's session, guys. Those were some of the basic SQL interview questions that are being asked nowadays. Now, the level of the interview questions entirely depend on the position you are applying for. It could be a simple SQL question or a query for analyst role, or it could be a more complex SQL interview questions and data modeling questions for data engineering roles. Now, in this tutorial, we have only discussed some of the basic questions or basic interview questions on SQL. Stay tuned for more videos wherein we'll discuss a further bit of questions like intermediate as well as the advanced questions that we'll be covering in our upcoming videos. Thank you for watching the video, guys. I hope you found this tutorial informative and helpful, and if you did, please leave us a like and make sure to share it with your friends and colleagues. If you have any further queries regarding any of the topics covered in today's session, feel free to let us know in the comment section below, and a team of experts will be more than happy to help resolve all your queries at the earliest. Until next time, stay safe and keep coding.